welcome to, I guess you've just had the intro session, and this is the first kind of breakout session that we have. And so if anyone isn't speaking on the panel, just encourage you to have yourself on mute, just to help keep audio clean. Yeah, as I said, this is the panel discussion on is EA too utilitarian for Christians? So what I'll do is I'll just do a couple of quick introductions and then do a bit of kind of scene setting, housekeeping, and then we'll pass over into the thick of the conversation. So quickly, I'm Alex. I'm hosting the conversation today of our panelists, Leah and Harriet. I'm a co-founder and current trustee for Outcomefocused for Christians. So this is kind of the best time of year for me when we kind of gather together like this. I work for the UK Civil Service, leading a team working on farm animal welfare policy. And I got involved in Outcomefocused maybe in the mid-2010s. So while I was studying philosophy at university, doing my undergrad and then master's, lots of time spent thinking around moral philosophy and how we ought to live. So this kind of conversation is right up my street. So I've been looking forward to all week. I can hear a bit of background noise. Can I just encourage people to go on mute? There we go. I think that's better. I'm just going to go for a mute all to solve that. So yeah, that's me. And then turning to Harriet. Harriet has a PhD in philosophy from the Johns Hopkins University. She's been professor at the University of San Diego for most of her adult life. Her research specialities are in metaphysics and philosophical theology, and she's published on the doctrine of the Trinity and the real presence doctrine too. She's a committed Anglican Christian and is an active member of the Society for Christian Philosophers. So big welcome, Harriet. Thanks for being here with us. And Leah Libresco and the wonderful Thalia. Welcome, Thalia. Leah Libresco Sargent is the author of Arriving at Amen and Building the Benedict Doctrine. She's worked as a curriculum developer at the Center for Applied Rationality, which is in the wider kind of effective and rationality ecosphere, and was a data journalist at 538. She grew up as an atheist and was received into the Catholic Church in 2012. She runs the Substack Other Feminisms, which is focused on the dignity of mutual dependence. So welcome, Leah, to you. Thanks so much for being with us. So I'll quickly try and rush through a bit of scene setting and then hand the mic over and get into the meat of the conversation, which is why we're here. So for those who might be a bit newer to effective altruism, kind of effective altruism as currently defined, and the definitions kind of merge over time as people tweak them and try and clean them up. But this is the definition by the Center for Effective Altruism. Effective altruism is an intellectual project using evidence and reason to figure out how to benefit others as much as possible. And it's also a practical project to take action based on the research and build a better world. So it's got this intellectual aspect, and there's also getting our hands dirty and doing things aspect too. Effective altruism is closely associated with consequentialism and utilitarianism ethics, and many of its founders come from that tradition. So it's often a question people have on the top of their minds is, what is effective altruism's relationship with utilitarianism or consequentialism? And how we view that as Christians? Is that something, is there a strong link? Even if there is that something we should be concerned about? And so that's some of the kind of work that we'll get into in this discussion as we go forward. And hopefully it'll also give us a wider opportunity to reflect on different ethical approaches that Christians might adopt and how we ought to view the ethical life and how we ought to live, as well as just zooming in on utilitarianism or consequentialism. In terms of timelines, we've got 45 minutes in total. So we'll be looking to finish at 12:15 EDT time or 5:15 in London, where I am. We have quite a hard cut off. We need to make sure we have a 5-minute break before the next session. So I'll do my best to try and keep us in order. In terms of the format, I'll start by asking a couple of questions of the panelists. And then there's Slido, which is a way you can stick your questions in. So we'll try and operate through the Slido medium. I'll just paste the link to Slido. I think it's in the agenda, but I'll paste it into the chat in just a second. And then we can pick up questions from there. Don't wait till the very end to put your questions in, because as people are discussing, you might notice things you're interested in. You can put, and then people can upvote them as we go. So by the time we get to the question section, we will know what people are most interested in discussing a bit further. I always want to encourage panelists, Leah, Harriet, to feel free to disagree. Don't feel free, you have to agree. I don't doubt you would, but there's nothing worse in a panel where everyone feels like they have to fall into line or something like that. And also to be critical where you want to be about effective altruism and your thoughts on that too. So hopefully we'll have a lively conversation. And then lastly, I think everyone now is on mute, but let's try and stay on mute until we get to the Slido conversation. And if you put your name down next to a question, I might invite you to ask it. If it's anonymous, I'll read it out myself. That's probably enough from me. I'm tempted to ask any questions, but I guess Leah, Harriet, does that all sound good to dive in? Have you got any further questions?
Sounds good.
Excellent. Okay, and just before I forget, I will paste the Slido link in the chat now. Great. I think it may have already been posted, so thank you for that. So the first question is a broad one, and maybe Leah will start this in your direction. So the question is, how would you summarize your approach to ethics, and how does your Christian faith factor in? So over to you, Leah.
Thank you so much, Alex. And everyone, Alex told us we have 3 minutes to summarize our approach to ethics, so wish us luck. But I am going to try and be brief because I'm peeking at the Slido and the questions are really good. So I grew up as an atheist. I became Catholic later in life. And on my way there, I went from deontology, a very rules-based approach to ethics, kind of looking for a logical way to test an ethical proposition, often through, can I universalize this? Can I ask this of everyone else in the same circumstances? Am I making sure I'm not treating myself as a special moral exemption? And I've found deontology very attractive, but as I got older in college, I made a switch to virtue ethics, which is still the main school of ethics I favor, aside from just Christianity writ large, but it's a way of approaching ethical questions. And one of the ways I'd summarize the difference is that deontology is about following your duty no matter how hard it is. And the way I interpreted it, which I think you should not hold against Immanuel Kant specifically, hold it only against me as a former deontologist, was that the most admirable thing ethically is to do the right thing when you really don't want to. So I didn't really take any pleasure in being nice to people who were nice to me, because what's admirable in that? I wanted to be nice to people who were terrible to me, which is great for being someone really into ethics in high school. So like excellent coping mechanism for high school specifically, but not very good broadly, because in some ways it meant I was disappointed when other people behaved well, because I felt that kind of capped how ethical I could be. Virtue ethics, by contrast, doesn't take the approach of ethics should be hard for you. The idea is that you should become an ethical person. And that means that the more I do the right thing, I become habituated to it. I kind of make it part of myself, knit it into part of my approach to the world, until doing the right thing isn't a huge struggle. It's the most natural thing to do. And it's admirable to make doing the right thing natural to yourself. I found this moving in some of the stories of Christian martyrs, particularly St. Thomas More, because in some ways, their approach to ethics was to be so focused on God and living closely with him that doing the wrong thing became not just unthinkable, but undoable. That you can no more deny Christ than if someone asked you to, jump out of a window and fly. You would say, look, even if I want to, I can't. That's not what I'm made for. That's not what I do. And virtue ethics asks us to take that approach to all ethical choices, to knit them into us so they become who we are, not just what we choose. That's my brief summary.
Excellent, thank you, Leah. And I think we'll have a bunch of opportunity to dig into those virtue ethics ideas. Harriet, can I put the same question to you? And just summarize, the question is, how would you summarize your approach to ethics, and how does your Christian faith factor in?
Yeah, my approach to ethics is that I am a consequentialist welfarist. And that is what most people think of utilitarianism as in the broad sense. So I'm a consequentialist. I hold that the normative status of any action or policy is determined by consequences. And the best action or the best policy is the policy that produces the greatest good. Now, the question of the normative status of agents, of persons, is a separate but related question. And I'm not really interested in that question. It's a separate question. So I'm interested in what constitutes a good action, a right action, because consequentialism, as I understand it, is action guiding. It's not about what makes a person a good person. It's about what makes an action a good action. Secondly, in addition to consequentialism, I am a welfarist, and that's to say I have an account of the good, and I hold that the good is simply the well-being for persons and other sentient beings. So what that means is that other things like the survival of the species, the environment, knowledge, art, are only instrumentally good. They're only means to an end, and that end is promoting the welfare of sentient beings. And let's see, let me put on my glasses so I can see what I wrote. Okay, now there is some debate as to what well-being is. Some hold that it's desire satisfaction, some that it's pleasure. That was Bentham's view. Some hold that it's happiness, whatever happiness is. And my view is that it's desire satisfaction, the satisfaction of informed desires. Whatever it is that you want, your good is getting it, and that's it. Now, the problem with utilitarianism, narrowly defined, is that it has no account of distribution. It just says maximize, or even worse, it says maximize average utility, which has terrible consequences. So if you're going to be a consequentialist, welfarist, you also need an account of distribution. And there are a lot of options available. You could be an egalitarian, you could be a prioritarian, you could have all sorts of different accounts of distribution. And what I would suggest is, or at least the kind of view on distribution that I am sympathetic to, is the view that what we want to do is get the maximum in. You know, we want it to be such that the person who is least well off is better off than they would be in any alternative circumstance. Now, as to how Christianity informs this view, my view of Christianity, as I understand it, is that it informs our moral intuitions in the deepest way. The Bible is not a rule book, but rather Christian theology in the deepest way informs our fundamental intuitions. And what Christianity as basis says is Christianity is the religion of the incarnation. That's the way Gore put it, I think. It's about God going into the world, emptying himself, going outward into the material world. So what this says to us is, first of all, that we should look outward. We should not look inward. We should just look outward, and we should look to the material world. We should work for the material benefit of others. So that's what it's like to me. And I think, at least my intuition is, that Christianity is absolutely inimical to the Greek aristocratic Aristotelian ethic of self-cultivation, the business of workouts to improve one's body, and attempts to improve one's virtue, the attempt to cultivate oneself. And that's why, to be honest, I think virtue ethics is inimical to Christianity, to the Christian method. And when you look at it and you think about the Greek view of what a God is, Jesus is in every way absolutely remote from this Greek ideal. He did not work out in the gym to cultivate his body. He was not in the business of cultivating his soul. He was in the business of saving the world, bringing benefits to the human race. And that's what I think is our obligation. I've never in my life been a deontologist, nor have I been a virtue ethicist. I've always been a jolly utilitarian, or rather, I've always been a crude consequentialist and welfarist. So that's my view.
I'm going to jump in here for a second, because we're definitely meeting Alex's request for some disagreement. I think, it's interesting to contrast the way Christ approaches the cultivation of virtue to the way we do, because of course, Christ is perfectly aligned with the Father's will. So in some ways, even in his life on earth, he's more an image of what our lives might be as saints with God in heaven, when indeed, I don't expect we'd be practicing virtue ethics to kind of cultivate a deeper alignment with the good, because we would be enjoying the beatific vision and fully, brimful with it. So in some ways, how does Christ's life set an example for us? In the context of virtue ethics, I say it gives us what we aim for, an image of our telos, though of course, we see Christ in both his human and divine nature setting that example. But in our lives on earth, I think we do have to cultivate ourselves, cultivate kenosis, self-emptying, so that we're ready to be the saints God has called us to be. If we were merely looking outward, we would be losing our attentiveness to the good God wills for each of us individually, as well as for the whole world collectively.
Well, I don't really understand that, because the view is that God came into the world, he became incarnate, he became material, and he emptied himself. That's kenosis. He did not look inward. God did not look inward. He created a world. And when he came to save the world, he emptied himself. He emptied himself and looked outward. It's all about outwardness.
The Trinity itself is an internal relation of God, looking at God, knowing God, loving God. So I think God certainly is turned outwards to us in his infinite love, but we see that love kind of shared among the three persons of the Trinity as well.
Yeah, that's social Trinitarianism, and that's just one view. It's become a very popular view. but that's just one view, and there's no evidence that anybody before, or is it Richard of St. Victor and Richard Swinburne following him held that view. This is not the view that the earlier Christians held, including my main squeeze, Gregory of Nyssa. But all I can say is that when we look at the idea of incarnation, the idea, I think this was Temple who said this, Christianity is the most materialistic of the great world religions. What it's all about is looking outward and working to improve the material well-being of others. End of story. That's ethics.
I'm curious what you think of the martyrs, and then I'll let Alex actually ask us an
they're
EA
fools.
question, right? But there's a great,
they were fools.
Wow, I just think then they're strongly diverging from the early church.
It's all very edifying. It's all very edifying, but most Christians during the period did not go for martyrdom. They got their little libelli, stamped from somebody else. They sent a slave, or they just sacrificed. So that's one option, but it's not an option that I think we're obliged to take.
All right, well, I'll pivot us towards the EA question, particularly here, because I think one of the kind of interesting questions about whether Christianity is a materialistic religion or focused on those outcomes comes from even just the little jokey meme I've seen shared where people share an image of the Christians in the arena being torn apart by lions, captioned, "God has a wonderful plan for your life." And I think one thing that is a real tension in EA and Christianity is, if God can redeem any suffering, or if we even might be called to offer our suffering for others, where does that leave us when we're also interested in relieving it on a larger scale as effective altruists? Back to you, Alex.
No, good. And good to see some healthy disagreement and also getting some good philosophical theology. So yeah, it's a good afternoon for me. Yeah, I think let's start to pivot in terms of actually looking at effective altruism as a worldview. And actually, how does it relate formally with utilitarianism or consequentialism? So the question I guess I want to move us on to is, EA is often perceived for a bunch of reasons as utilitarian or consequentialism. Is this true? Is it a utilitarian movement intrinsically? And then I guess linked to that, should we consider EA as too utilitarian for Christians? And I guess that starts to get into some of the conversation we were just having then. So maybe Leah, do you want to kick us off on that?
Yeah, I think EA tilts outcome focused in part because the goal is to see how we can measure different interventions against each other, and often to measure them what feels like the most neutral way, which for many people feels like the answer is numbers. Now, numbers aren't necessarily neutral. I'd point to the example of QALY's, quality adjusted life years, or DALY's disability adjusted life years, as something that allows us to quantify and compare different outcomes or different modes of life. But it's hard to check that those are correct. They involve kind of inscribing values into how we put the numbers together. They often involve people who are not disabled estimating how much they would discount the worth of their own life, or how much they would trade against a disability. And the estimates of people who are imagining a disability tend not to line up with the experiences of people living with a disability. So we have kind of a source of values bias there. And that can just be a tension throughout. But I think one of the best applications of that utilitarian mindset is simply to say, hey, let's check if this works. Let's have places where we do randomized controlled trials. Let's look for a better metric to guide our giving than just what had been a prevailing metric before the advent of groups like GiveWell, which was overhead. People treated as though all spending on getting your intervention to people, running your organization, was waste. But we care a lot more about how much good does this intervention do. I think this consequences motivated approach is most helpful in contrasting different ways of approaching the same problem. Do I care most about distributing malaria nets, distributing chemo prevention, a combination of both, if my goal is reducing suffering from malaria? But it doesn't tell me as much, how do I judge the nets versus education and character? And then we have to push a little beyond just the numbers. But the other thing I'd say that's kind of a real tension, I think one of the bigger tensions for Christians in EA and looking at a utilitarian framework, is often utilitarianism is just looking at money moved, because the impact can be so large. And that's why you might approach something like an earning to give choice, where you work in a job that doesn't feel like it's good for your own character necessarily, but it's just moving enough money that it feels like it's good on net. Can be a tense question there, but it's a less fraught seeming question. One thing that we've approached as a family of people who are interested in EA and faithful Christians is, how do we feel about recurring donations? everyone knows recurring donations are one of the most effective ways to make sure you actually donate. The more you set it and forget it, the more you can rely that this becomes part of your life forever, because it asks so little of you as a deliberate choice. But as Christians, I think we are called to make deliberate choices. And I want to make sure that my charity doesn't wind up so done at a remove for me that it's just a matter of scheduled bank transfers that don't affect how I approach other people. So that's a place where my family's kind of tried to make specific plans. In our case, it means giving more spontaneously with prayer and attentiveness to need, matching donations we make to people who are near to us with donations to far people, usually through GiveWell, usually through Give Directly for us particularly. And then at the end of the year, doing a bit of catch up, having a target for giving. And if we don't hit it spontaneously, we top up at the end of the year. But we don't want giving to be so removed from our active choices and character formation as I think a purely utilitarian non-Christian EA might be, who would say, as long as the money gets there, that's the crucial thing.
Yeah.
Thanks, Leah. Harriet?
Yeah, well, they say reality has a liberal bias, and I think EA has a utilitarian bias, where utilitarian is used in the broad sense. So I'll use this as an abbreviation for consequentialist welfareism, right? And I'm a moral satisficer. I'm not really interested in getting any better than a C+, B-, good. So I'm not going to give everything, but I'm going to do my best, and I'm going to try to do it the easy way possible. So I have all these things set up because I don't want to be involved. I don't think my sentimentalities or my involvement or my satisfaction is of any real worth. What matters is just getting the goods. And that doesn't just mean moving money. It means moving utility, but money is a pretty good surrogate for utility. My take on this thing is that we should be impartial. We should not ideally consider those close by of any more importance than those far away. Now, we're imperfect, so of course we care more for our families and friends than we do for people around the world, but that's just an imperfection. And I also think that, we're interested in achieving an end, just as God was interested in achieving an end, the salvation of the world. Right. So what we should aim for is getting the biggest bang for the buck. We should also be hard and tough-minded and calculating. And there's so much in the church ethos that I found alienating, the sentimentalities, all of this stuff. I think, you have to calculate, you got to get the biggest bang for the buck, you got to send it out and make people better off. I think, it's important to be hard and tough. And that's something that Christianity, at least the current ethos of Christianity, has been inimical to. And I think that's something that has to change.
All right, so everyone can tell where my cards are because I've got someone close to me I have a particular duty to who's appeared on this call because she's not napping. But I don't think that's a problem. I don't think sentimentality is a problem that we're trying to grow past either. I think everything God gives us is something we're meant to return to him sanctified to his purpose. So I'm not trying to detach from my sentiments any more than I'm trying to detach from my body or from my family. I'm trying to ask, how are these natural desires and these natural goods able to be consecrated to God's purpose and able to be offered back to him? And that's why I'm reluctant to kind of take those near-term asks and demands from friends, from people in my community, and just say, these are something I have to sever myself from. I want them to be a natural, love that I respond to and strengthen. I don't want to practice saying no to need that's immediate. And I don't want to practice callousness towards the people I have the greatest contact with. And that's why part of my family's approach is that when we give to someone who's near us, most recently, contributing to funeral costs for a friend of ours who died this past week, then we match that donation, whether one-to-one or larger, with the donation to Give Directly. Because I want the natural loves that I have for people in my life to be my spur to broaden my love and not only just give automatically, but cultivate a habit of prayer and a habit of love for the people who I don't meet.
I did not say be callous to people who are close by. I didn't say reject people who are close by in favor of those further away. I don't have any particular program, but I also think we have to recognize that the motivation for action for different people can be different. And I don't feel this. What motivates me is an interest in getting rid of irrationality, and the maldistribution of utility in the world, the great maldistribution, is highly irrational, and it bugs me. So what motivates me is just getting things fixed and creating a more rational world. And part of creating a more rational world is creating a fairer distribution of goods, because right now we're nowhere close to that. And that, I believe, is the Christian message: to fix things, make the world better.
Thanks both. I can see a lively set of comments coming in on the Slido, and I'm keen actually we reserve as much time for getting through those as possible. I guess I'm going to take chair's privilege a little bit and throw a question your way, Harriet, before I do that, which is one of the things I think about a lot is with respect to wanting to have, I guess I'm quite interested in consequentialism and having judging my actions on the basis of the consequences of them. How much space is there for a Christian, or how we think about taking actions which actually maybe in common sense Christian ethics, there might be concerns around, so like things which might involve like slight deception. I'm not talking about outright lying or something like that, but actually maybe by being a bit liberal with the truth or something, you might be able to steer a conversation at work, which results in like much better outcomes. I'm a civil servant. I'm meant to I've got lots of things I've signed up to do, but often in a work situation, you might realize that taking a certain course through, which maybe some people might consider slightly dubious, might result in really good outcomes. How much space do you think that there is, particularly with respect to effective altruism, in terms of the community and trying to have a good community norms too? Is it ever the case where like the ends justify the means? How do you think we ought to approach that as effective altruists, thinking, and Christian effective altruists in particular?
Well, I lie all the time, right? But the problem is, I mean, there have been noble lies. That comes from Plato. And a lot of these noble lies, in fact, most of these noble lies backfire. And I could use a variety of examples. For example, the Bakke decision, which affirmed affirmative action was justified in the interest of promoting diversity. Now, that was a noble lie, and it's backfired because the whole diversity business has undermined attempts to promote fairness. So I think when you lie, you gotta be careful about what the consequences of lying are. So I just don't see anything that's per se. Obviously, if you're a rule utilitarian, you want to promote general truthfulness, or else you're going to undermine social capital. But there's nothing intrinsically bad about lying as far as I'm concerned, as long as you overall succeed in good consequences.
Gotcha. So some Christians might think there might be things like side constraints, where broadly you're meant to maximize or kind of optimize for consequences, but there are certain restrictions on your actions which you'll not overstep, and you're not persuaded that there are those sorts of restrictions apart from if they.
I'm just a jolly crude utilitarian. I've never had an ethics course. My field is metaphysics.
Gotcha. Cracking.
And I think everyone can guess my answer to the lying question. Raise your hand if you think I'm against lying broadly for the people on camera. Yes, so I think I've successfully given the underlying rule. So I'll just go to the next question.
I can see a few hands up. I'm broadly going to take questions from Slido just because that's probably the most democratic approach. But do put your question on there, and if we have time, I might look to hands at the end. So the top voted question, at least if my browser is refreshing properly, says this. So actually, it's a bit of a reverse question. How can we make Christianity inviting or even compelling to those coming from a very secular utilitarian worldview? Leah, do you want to kick off with that?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, because there are certain kinds of pitches people make that I'm against here. And that tends to be, well, Christianity is something where Christians tend to live longer. People connected to a strong community are happier. They have more care at the end of life. When you ask them how happy they are on a 7-point scale, their happiness is slightly higher than those who aren't. And I think actually the witness is saying that may be true, and we're glad about that, but we don't care. And the reason is, it really matters whether Christianity is true. It's not just a self-help program. It's not, a life hack. It's a truth proposition, and it's a person. We're not asking someone to find an imaginary friend or cultivate a tulpa, to have a better feeling about themselves. We're making a claim about what's true. And then we're also making the baseline claim, which cuts very strongly against the utilitarian line, that we're made for the truth and we live best when serving the truth. So I think the pitch tends to be actually kind of the shocking countercultural thing of, I care about this primarily because it is true. And I also have faith because of the nature of who God is, that the truth is what I'm made for. But it's less a utilitarian argument that you can make for the Christian claim. I think you can take a kind of Chestertonian approach, which is that one of the things that formed his conversion, and mine as well, is examining different ethical questions and finding that the church has spoken the truth and has spoken it before you expected it to. So that made a difference for me as well, examining certain questions and finding that I came to agree with church teaching even when I didn't expect to. But that's my broad approach. I think it actually is a countercultural, non-outcome oriented pitch we have to make, because we're not selling, a Gwyneth Paltrow kind of wellness program.
Excellent. Harriet, do you have anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, this is where I have an anomalous view. I was always just interested in religion. I'm fascinated by theology. I love churches and ceremonies. I'm a member of church crawling and all this. So I just find it very, very attractive, right? But as far as my ethical views, before I was converted, I was into Ayn Rand, because that's attractive to me. Hard, tough, life is warfare, fight it out, right? Right. And then I was reading the Bible, right? And I was reading about Paul talking about the body of Christ. And I had this intellectual vision of a body composed of many, many, many bodies of all of us, almost like Hobbes' picture of the Leviathan. And I had this insight that we're all in it together. It's not just everything is a zero-sum game, because my assumption when I was growing up was really the better things are for me, the worse they are for everybody else, the better for others, the worse for me. And I care about me, and I'm going to fight it out and get the most I can. And then I saw it isn't like that. Life isn't a zero-sum game. So I guess persuading people that that is the vision, that is the vision of who we are and what the world is the way to sell Christianity.
Thank you. So the next question on the list actually does broach back into some of the earlier conversation we're having. How much do the practical recommendations of living everyday moral life differ between utilitarianism and virtue ethics? So I think probably both of you have thrown up a few things. Maybe choose one more each where you think they're actually going to come apart. Because I think there is some views say that actually virtue ethics, properly understood, if you have prudence and wisdom as some of your virtues, and that might actually end up encouraging a lot of action, which looks quite similar to at least some forms of consequentialism properly understood. So Leah, you want to kick off?
I think for one thing, virtue ethics makes you proof against certain kinds of moral blackmail. I'd give us a specific example here. Members of the persecuted church in Japan during the time of persecution being asked to deny Christ in order to save the lives of other believers. Virtue ethics takes that kind of blackmail off the table. People can't coerce you to do the wrong thing by kind of stacking a lot of good on the other side to bribe you. And I think that also kind of comes up a little bit, not just in that big example, but in smaller examples where people are trying to decide, okay, how much money does it need to be for something I think is wrong to be the right choice? And I think this in some ways goes to perhaps the only point on which we disagree, because I really liked your portrait of what moved you about Christianity. Christianity is not a scarcity-minded faith. EA can be kind of scarcity-minded. There's a lot of suffering. There's a limited amount of people offering to give. We're trying to do the best we can with the limited resources we have. But to an extent, Christianity does stand athwart that, because God is not limited by scarcity. And then to a large extent, we don't fear as much that by doing the right thing, we'll have made the wrong choice, that we believe that following the Lord and doing the right thing, being kind, being charitable, not denying Christ, is always the right choice if we can't figure out exactly how.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, in this fallen world, we are limited by scarcity. If we weren't, then we could not sin, because there would be no competition. But the world is a world of scarce resources, and we have to do what we can. And as I say, for me, what prevents me from getting steamed up about this is, as I say, I'm a moral satisficer. I only want to do so much. I'm not willing to do any more. And I don't see why I should be willing to do more anymore, that I should be willing to be a perfectly wonderful pianist or perfectly wonderful at anything, as I say. So I do the best I can, and I don't worry about it.
I mean, I think the reason to worry about it is because we're called to, follow Christ in giving all. and that we lay down our whole lives for God, not necessarily by dying, but having that same level of devotion and love for, our friends, broadly construed, as he did. And the nature of that sacrifice can look different. It can look like martyrdom. It can look like consecrated religious life where you give your entire life in prayer. And it can look like a quiet life of just faithful service to those around you, to global causes. But we are kind of told as Christians we're not allowed to hold anything back. EA people often worry, am I allowed to hold anything back monetarily for my own comfort? But as Christians, we're actually not limited to that demand just being made of our bank account. There's nothing in our lives that's our own apart from God. Everything is a gift from him. And the question is, in what way do we make it available to others?
Well, that's all very poetic, but I'm not committed to that. I have no intention of giving my all, whether money or anything else. That's it. As I say, I'm satisfied with a B-, C+ goodness rating. I'm sorry if that sounds cynical, but yeah.
No, it's good to hear different ethical worldviews come out. So yeah. The next question I want to go to is one from David, I think David Lawrence. This question: should Christians have their own take on what constitutes happiness or maybe well-being under your account, Harriet? And if so, what would be the main differences from a more secular definition? Harriet, do you want to lead off on that one?
Yeah, my view is completely secular. I don't think that Christianity tells us how to be moral. It answers the question, why should we be moral? Why should we do any of this stuff? Ethics is a purely secular discipline, and it demands of Christians what it demands of anybody else. Okay, but we should be ethics is just plain secular, and Christianity gives us the impulse to pursue it.
And just so I understand, in terms of your account of what the definition of well-being is, are you a hedonist or are you an objectivist theorist? Did you say you're a desirist?
Desire satisfaction. The satisfaction of informed desires is well-being, whatever those desires are.
Good, because I think some Christians might have this, again, just to throw up another view, I imagine some Christians might have this view that I think there are different things, multiple different things that constitute well-being, maybe partly desire satisfaction, partly hedonist mental states, partly some objectivist theories, and one of those might be being brought into right relationship with God. So I suspect there are some people in the community who might think that actually part of what makes one's life go well for them would be being in right relationship with God. And that might be a way in which.
Can I chip in, as this is my question? Is that right?
Yeah, it's yours. Good,
yeah.
David.
Cool. Well, I guess just say you're using a desire satisfaction theory, there might be certain desires which as Christians we think are not good, or I don't really want to use this example, but it's like classic and
oops, froze.
Well, David, we've lost you, unfortunately. I wonder if you're going to use about sadist pleasure or something, or sadist satisfaction.
Apparently it was such a terrible desire that you cut him off.
Yeah, well, it makes you better off. It doesn't make other people better off, but that's tough. You shouldn't do it, not because it doesn't make you better off, but just because it makes other people a whole lot worse off. That's it.
So I guess most people would be uncomfortable with the idea that at least the world is better off in some respect because that sadist was satisfied. And just to be clear, I'm like a consequentialist, but I think it's just like one problem with desire.
Yeah, it's a toughie.
And there might be sorry,
utility monsters are a problem.
I didn't catch that, sorry.
Utility monsters are a problem.
Yeah, sure. So I think the question is just should Christians, informed by their Christianity, have any views on what may or may not constitute happiness? So I think, as Alex said, as a Christian, you might value relationship with God differently to a non-Christian. And in some ways, it would seem weird if you didn't value relationship with God differently if you're a Christian. But so I think when you say ethics is entirely secular, I guess that could be true in terms of the framework could be secular, but it seems like having a substantive worldview about what's valuable, that seems fairly implied by Christianity. It would be odd for someone to believe that God has saved them, but then have zero view on the value of being in a relationship with God. So it feels like that should alter our objective framework, or objective function.
All I can say is it makes no difference to me, right? The only difference Christianity makes is it tells me that I should be trying to promote other people's well-being, because if I weren't a Christian, I would be on with Ayn Rand. I wouldn't do a damn thing for anyone. But as far as what I should do, that's completely informed by ethics understood as a secular discipline.
So just to be clear, you don't place any moral weight on someone being in a relationship with God.
Correct.
And,
Okay, that's like an unusual view for a Christian, I think.
and I'm going to be here on a different side of the question. I think we're all called to will the good of the other, and that some of this discussion has been about being convinced that it's right to will the good of the other. But I think Christianity has a lot to say that's necessary to hear about what that good is. That I think often a lot of the kind of almost culture war or other difficult conversations I have come when people have two different ideas of what the good of the other is, and then become convinced the other person is therefore willing bad for the other. And I think often those clashes are about both strongly willing the good and disagreeing about what the good is. And that's where we have to be able to talk about how do we sort out our different sense of what is good for someone else. And they're kind of the trivial things, which is, I think it's probably better, all things considered, for you not to sprain your ankle than for you to sprain your ankle. But then they're kind of the bigger questions that people are willing to entertain in day-to-day life, especially at the most personal levels. Can someone's desire be bad for them? And I think, and I'll ask again for just a casual show of hands, like whether anyone has ever had the experience of having a friend who's dating someone where you think you should break up. This is bad for you as your friend. I know this, and I'm seeing some hands. I think it's an example where willing the good of someone means willing the frustration of what they understand their desire to be, because you think their desire is not good for them, or it's desiring a lesser good that's competing with a higher good or is out of synchronization there. The highest good, what we're made for in terms of happiness or our good, is full union with God and join the beatific vision with him forever. That doesn't necessarily answer the question of, should I separate out the plastics in my recyclables? So kind of there's a lot of work to get to the everyday ethical questions, but that's the governing question. And I think for the question you've posed, David, of how does this affect what we think about other people's relationship with God, I would say as someone who was an atheist and is now Catholic, everyone has a relationship with God because God is ardently pursuing everyone. The question is how they respond. So I don't think of my goal even as necessarily being creating that relationship. It's nurturing or fostering. And I have a relationship, that's now a deeper one than one I had as an atheist, but one that's still wounded by my own sins. So it's not as though because I'm Christian, I've now solved the problem of having a relationship with God.
Yeah, but that highest good isn't something we achieve. It comes by grace. What we can do is improve the material conditions of people's lives. Okay. And when you look at what Christian philosophers do in terms of ethics, de facto, they're doing the same thing that secular philosophers do in terms of ethics. Ethics is a secular discipline. And myself, to me, the impetus for Christianity, for becoming involved in the church, was metaphysics, not ethics. Right? I'm interested in the doctrine of the Trinity. I'm interested in philosophical theology. I'm interested in the supernatural generally. The ethics is a side issue, and that's a purely secular business.
And there's loads more we could keep going at. This is absolutely fascinating. I'm conscious we've just hit 1:15, and I want to honor JD's strict time instructions to make sure we can all have a break before the next session. So just want to say a big thank you to you, Harriet, and to you, Leah, for taking to heart this idea of having a good, healthy disagreement and having a good conversation about it, and loads we can pick up moving on from there. So if everyone just gives a nice virtual clap to the panelists, thanks so much.
All right, God bless you all.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you all for being here, and thank you, Leah. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, where do I get to the next one?